What it was like to be a child in the UK during the 1960s. The 1960s in the UK was a time of vibrant change, cheeky rebellion, and wide-eyed wonder. For children, it was a decade of freedom, simplicity, and invention. When kids played outdoors all day, milk arrived in glass bottles, and technology hadn't yet crept into every corner of life. It was a generation raised without smartphones, but rich in imagination. In this nostalgic journey through what it was like to be a child in the UK during the 1960s, we'll relive the toys, schools, fashions, and flavours that made growing up during this swinging decade truly unforgettable. Life at home, cosy, crowded, and filled with love. In the early 1960s, most British families lived in small, often overcrowded homes. Central heating was rare, and many relied on coal fires or paraffin heaters to warm a single room. Bedrooms were often shared with siblings, and bathrooms, if there was one, were basic and chilly. Kitchens featured enamel sinks, freestanding cookers, and Formica countertops. Microwaves and dishwashers were unheard of. Families usually sat down to meals together. Hearty dishes like shepherd's pie, spam fritters, or bangers and mash were common. Dessert might be a tin of peaches with evaporated milk, or jelly and custard. Mums typically stayed at home, managing the household and minding the kids. Dads went out to work, often in factories, shops, or offices. There was always a pot of tea on the go and a tin of biscuits to offer guests. Life was simple but filled with structure, warmth, and routine. Toys and games, a world fueled by imagination. Children in the 1960s made their own fun, often outdoors and always on the move. Toys were tactile and mechanical, not digital. British kids played with Meccano sets, Hornby trains, and corgi or dinky toy cars. Girls loved Cindy dolls, launched in 1963 as a British alternative to Barbie. Classic games like Ludo, Cluedo, Snakes and Ladders and Mousetrap were household staples. Outdoors, it was all about skipping ropes, marbles, conkers, hopscotch, and playing Kirby by bouncing balls off street curbs. Creativity was king. Boxes became spaceships. A stick could be a sword, a wand, or a horse. Toys weren't always bought. They were built, shared, or passed down from older siblings. It's one of the reasons what it was like to be a child in the UK during the 1960s feels so different today. There was less stuff, but far more imagination. School life, discipline, ink, and milk breaks. Going to school in the 1960s was a strict and formal affair. Classrooms were filled with wooden desks, blackboards, and inkwells. Children used fountain pens or dip pens until biros became more widespread later in the decade. Blotting paper was standard equipment. Pupils stood when teachers entered the room. Lessons focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and spelling. Rote learning was the norm. The 11+ exam, taken at age 11, determined whether a child went to a grammar school, secondary modern, or technical school, a decision that shaped future opportunities. Discipline was tough. Corporal punishment was common in many schools, particularly for boys. Girls might receive lines or detention. School uniforms were compulsory, often scratchy and worn year-round. One sweet memory shared by many children is the free school milk. Thanks to the School Milk Act of 1946, every child received a 1/3 pint of milk daily, served cold in glass bottles with a straw. The phrase "milk monitor" still stirs memories of proud little helpers distributing the creamy cartons. Clothes, hand-me-downs, and home knits. Fashion for children in the 1960s was practical, modest, and largely homemade. Most boys wore short trousers until their early teens, even in winter, paired with long grey socks and polished leather shoes. Girls wore pleated skirts, knee-high socks, and knitted cardigans, often made by mums or nans. Sunday best was sacred. Pressed shirts, polished shoes, and tidy hair were essential for church or special outings. Clothes were rarely thrown away. They were patched, handed down, and even altered to fit the next child. School uniforms were worn proudly and without much variety. There were no designer brands or fast fashion. Yet there was something timeless and endearing about the style. Bright hair ribbons, bobble hats, duffel coats, and the familiar creak of Clark's sandals on linoleum floors. Entertainment, the magic of radio and television. At the start of the 1960s, many homes still relied on the radio. Children's Hour, Listen with Mother, and radio dramas kept imaginations ticking. But by the mid-60s, television had become a household staple. Black and white at first, with colour arriving in 1967 on BBC Two. Children's TV was a wonderland. Blue Peter launched in 1958 and quickly became iconic. Other favourites included Andy Pandy, Watch with Mother, The Magic Roundabout 1965, Trumpton, Camberwick Green and The Explosive Thunderbirds, which hit screens in 1965 with its puppetry and high-stakes rescues. Saturday morning cinema clubs were hugely popular. Odeon and ABC theatres offered matinees packed with cartoons, short films and prizes. A few pennies bought entry, sweets and a seat among a sea of excited kids. Music too was entering children's lives, especially older ones. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones and Dusty Springfield became household names. Record players spun vinyl singles in bedrooms across Britain, offering a soundtrack to a generation growing up in rhythm with a cultural revolution. Food and sweets, tinned treasures, and penny treats. British childhood in the 1960s came with its own unique menu. Dinners at home were modest but filling. School lunches offered cottage pie, minced beef, fish on Fridays, and the occasional boiled cabbage. Pudding was always exciting, jam roly-poly, semolina or pink custard. Treats, though, were unforgettable. The corner shop was a wonderland. A few pennies bought a paper bag filled with blackjacks, fruit salads, flying saucers, sherbet fountains, and Parma violets. You could buy a wham bar, a curly whirly, or some cola cubes and still have change left over. Fish fingers, introduced by Birdseye in 1955, became a 1960s staple, alongside Heinz baked beans and Smash instant mash. Angel Delight arrived in 1967 and was an instant hit. For a rare night out, families might visit a Wimpy bar, Britain's early burger joint experience. And who could forget the joy of a Fab or Zoom ice lolly from the local ice cream van, with its chimes echoing down the street. Playtime adventures, streets were our kingdoms. What it was like to be a child in the UK during the 1960s often meant spending nearly all daylight hours outdoors. Streets weren't busy with traffic. Children walked to school alone, played football in the road, and knew every back alley, field and fence in their neighbourhood. Games like British Bulldog, Kick the Can, It, and Hide and Seek ruled playgrounds and cul-de-sacs. Girls played elastics and hopscotch, made daisy chains, or created mud pies. Boys climbed trees, built dens, or raced down hills on homemade trolleys made of pram wheels and scrap wood. The Rally Chopper, though only released in 1969, became an instant symbol of cool among older kids at the close of the decade. If you owned one, you ruled the streets. There was trust and community. Neighbours looked out for each other. You came home when the streetlights turned on, covered in bruises, giggles, and adventure. Holidays and days out, homegrown joy. For most families in the 1960s, holidays meant staying in the UK. The seaside was king. Blackpool, Margate, Scarborough and Skegness were packed each summer with families eating fish and chips on the promenade and splashing in chilly waters. Butlins and Ponteens were holiday camp royalty, affordable escapes with chalets, swimming pools, redcoats talent shows, and knobbly knees competitions. Kids made friends, entered races, and danced under fairy lights. Day trips were just as special. A ride on a steam train, still common until the beaching cuts of 1963. A visit to London to see the guards at Buckingham Palace, or a picnic in the countryside with hard-boiled eggs and jam sandwiches. These were the moments that shaped memories. The 1960s. Shift, when childhood began to change. By the late 1960s, the world was changing. Colour television had arrived. Space exploration captured imaginations, especially after the moon landing in 1969, broadcast live to captivated British audiences. Music, fashion, and language were shifting. Older children had their own opinions and a taste for freedom. The traditional family model began to evolve. More women entered the workforce. Comprehensive schools began replacing grammar schools in some parts of the UK, reshaping education. The first signs of the modern era crept in, but childhood was still rooted in play, simplicity, and community. Children of the 60s stood on a bridge between the post-war past and a digital future. They experienced just enough of both worlds to be shaped by them, and to remember what a truly unplugged childhood looked like. What it was like to be a child in the UK during the 1960s was a magical blend of freedom, family, and fun. In an age before screens and constant noise, kids grew up on imagination, friendships, and everyday joys that still echo fondly through the memories of a generation. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe and turn on the notification bell.